So now I have all my pieces cut out, it's time to prepare them for stitching together. And the first thing we need to do is to neaten the edges of the pieces. So that's going to be the long side seams on both the front and back dress pieces, and then along the shoulder seams as well. The way to neaten the edges, there's a few different methods. So if you have one, you can use an overlocker. You can use a zigzag stitch, which is what I'm going to do today, and that's what most home sewers in the 1960s would have probably done. Alternatively, you can cut all of the pieces out with pinking shears. So to neaten the edges, I'm going to use a zigzag stitch, and I just want to line up the edge of the stitch with the edge of the fabric. Now the main seams on the dress pieces are finished. It's time to stay stitch around the neckline and the curved keyhole front of the main dress piece, and also the curved neckline on the back of the dress. And this is going to help to stabilise the area, as these are curves, and just stitching means that they won't stretch out as we continue with the sewing up of the dress. So a stay stitch is simply a straight stitch which you sew within the seam allowance close to the edge of the fabric. And it's a good idea to start in the middle point of a curve and then stitch outwards. So I'll stitch this side first, and then I'll stitch around the neckline here. Then I'll start again in the centre, stitch around here and around here. So the next step is to stitch in our bust darts. We fold the two right sides of the fabric together and then pin it in place. And then we're going to stitch along the line we marked out earlier onto the fabric. And the best way to get a really nice smooth dart is to actually start stitching from the outside edge, stitch all the way along to the end, and then instead of back stitching here, to run off a few stitches and then tie it off by hand. Okay, so if I put my needle at the outside edge of the bust dart and do a small back stitch, and then I'm just going to stitch all the way along here. And then if I run off the end and pull out my thread, I can tie that in a knot, like so. So now I want to just press my darts down towards the hem of the dress. So now I have my bust darts stitched in place and all pressed down nicely. It is time to join the dress at the shoulder seams. So I just place the front and back pieces together and match them up along the shoulders. And now I'm just going to stitch 1 centimetre from the edge on both shoulder seams. So now I can just back stitch as before. And now I just want to press my shoulder seams open nice and flat. The next stage is to prepare our pockets, and I'm doing the curved pockets here. So I have my main pocket piece and then my pocket facing, and I'm going to have a contrast pocket flap because I have cut this out in my white fabric and this in my pattern fabric. So I need to put the right sides of the fabric together here. And then I'm going to stitch around just that top curve here. So now I have stitched my pocket flap and my main pocket together, I need to turn it inside out along this curved seam, and to help me, I can just trim away the seam allowance around the curved edge. So just trimming the interfacing side of the seam allowance down a few millimeters from the edge of the stitching. And finally, a few clips into the seam allowance will help me when I come to press it the right way out. Okay, and now you can see I've got a nice smooth edge. So I'm just going to press the curved seam of the pocket flap so that the main fabric is hidden underneath my contrast fabric. And then when I come to fold over my flap, it will be hidden underneath. So now with a quick gathering stitch going all the way around the long edge of the curved pocket, if I just pull slightly on that curve, you can see it helps to encourage it to turn inwards, meaning I can press in the seam allowance and get a lovely smooth curve. There you go, one lovely smooth curve. I also have a lovely smooth curve here. So now I have my pockets prepared, I can secure the pocket flap with a button. Now I have my two pockets ready to attach to my dress. So now I've placed my pockets onto the main body of the dress, lining up with the notches from my paper pattern piece. Now is the stage for you to try on the dress and decide if this is the right pocket placement for you, and check the fit before we move on to the collar and top stitching down the pockets. So if you would like to fit the dress, what you want to do is to fold the back piece down so you have the pieces right sides together, and you'll just stitch along the two main side seams. And you'll want to do that just by hand or on a very long stitch on the machine, as you're going to need to unpick it again in order to continue with the next step once you're happy with the fit. Now I'm going to top stitch my pockets into place on the main front piece of the dress, and I'm just going to stitch very closely to the edge all the way around the outside curve. If you had an edge foot for your machine, now would be the moment to use it. You can also see that I've left the gathering stitch in place as I stitch around, which is just helping to keep everything into position, and I can pull that out at the end. Okay, so now I've top stitched my pockets in place, and I'm just leaving them pinned along the side seam edge, and it's time to move on to the collar. I have two identical collar pieces here, and I'm going to match them right sides together and stitch all the way around the outside edges of the collar. This I will leave open because that will get attached to the neck edge of the dress. For a really professional finish, a good idea is to just trim around the outside edges of just one of the collar pieces. That means that one collar will be slightly smaller from the other, and when you do stitch around it, it will naturally curve in underneath and give you a really nice, neat finish. All I need to do is just trim very carefully a couple of millimeters. And this means that when we stitch the two collar pieces together, it creates a kind of under collar and a top collar, and encourages this slightly smaller piece to sit underneath the slightly larger one. So now this side is the wrong side where I've ironed on my interfacing already, and these are the two right sides of the collar. This one is now slightly smaller than this one, and I'm going to match them up and pin carefully. And you still want to pin so that the edges match, and when you stitch you'll just slightly ease them together. And I'm going to mark the undercollar so you know which way round they go. And I'm just going to stitch all the way around the 3 outside edges here. So now I've stitched my 2 collar pieces together, all I need to do is trim away the seam allowance around the outside edges. And then, just as with the curved pocket facing, I can just snip carefully into the rounded collar, taking care not to snip through the stitching. And then when I come to turn the collar the right way out, you can see this is my undercollar piece. I should be able to roll that seam just to the underside and get a lovely, neat finish. And I can just press that slightly smaller undercollar that I trimmed away underneath the seam, and then it sits lovely and neat. So now that's my collar pieces stitched together with the neck edge left open, and that will be attached to my dress. So the next step is to make our button loop, and for that we need our tiny little rectangular piece, and all we need to do is to fold it lengthways, right sides together, and then we're going to stitch along the folded edge about 3 millimeters from the edge of the fabric. Okay, so now I've stitched my channel, I can trim away the seam allowance. Now all I need to do is turn it inside out. Okay, so I've secured the thread to the end of the button loop, and then I just need to feed the needle through the channel, and then I can just pull on the thread and it magically turns inside out. So now you have your thread loop prepared, you can just turn it in, and a tacking stitch will secure your button loop. Make sure that your button can fit through your button loop.